What if the only thing standing between you and the life you actually want isn't money or luck or connections, but a single sentence you keep repeating to yourself without even noticing? I can't. Two small words. And over 100 years ago, a man who grew up an orphan, who worked as a farmhand, who slept in barns and taught himself to read by firelight, sat down and wrote a book to prove that those two words are the biggest lie most people will ever tell themselves. He watched broken men become senators. He watched a shy country girl lead armies. He watched a stammering, ridiculed politician become a prime minister who once told a jeering parliament, "You will yet hear me," and they did. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why some people seem to attract success like a magnet, while others with just as much talent, just as much education, just as much opportunity, spend their whole lives standing still, and it has almost nothing to do with talent at all. Stay with me to the end, because the final chapter of this book asks a question that will completely change how you think about where you came from and what you actually owe the world in return for being here. Let's begin. The man behind these words is Orison Swett Marden. Before he was a best-selling author, before his books sold in the millions and were translated into languages he never even heard spoken, he was a boy with almost nothing. He lost both his parents by the time he was 7 years old. He was passed between relatives and strangers, worked on farms for people who were not always kind to him, and grew up in a world that gave him every reason to believe he would never amount to much of anything. But somewhere along the way, Marden got his hands on a book about self-help, and something inside him shifted. He decided that circumstances were not going to write the ending of his story. He worked his way through school, went on to earn multiple degrees, ran hotels, studied medicine and law. And then, when a fire destroyed almost everything he owned, he did something remarkable. Instead of despairing, he sat down and started writing about the very thing that had carried him through every hardship of his life. The belief that the mind, rightly trained, can lift a person out of almost any circumstance. That belief became a movement. Marden's books, magazines, and lectures reached working men and women, immigrants, farmers, clerks, and students all across America and beyond, at a time when there was no radio, no television, no internet. Just a printed page, passed from hand to hand, dog-eared and underlined by people hungry for a reason to keep going. The book we're exploring today, published in 1908, is called He Can Who Thinks He Can, and Other Papers on Success in Life. It is not a dry list of business tips. It's closer to a series of sermons, delivered not from a pulpit, but from a desk, aimed squarely at the ordinary person who had begun, quietly, to doubt themselves. Marden takes on 18 different angles of the same central idea, that self-belief, purpose, honest work, and character are the true foundations of successful life, and that luck, wealth, and family connections are, at best, a poor substitute for them. He wrote in an era of robber barons and self-made men, of Lincoln's memory still fresh in the national imagination, of Roosevelt in the White House, and he pulled his examples from all of it. Presidents, immigrants, inventors, failures, and unknown men and women he had personally met and interviewed. So let's step into his first and most famous chapter, the one that gives this whole book its title, and the one that asks a question every single one of us needs to answer for ourselves. Marden opens with Abraham Lincoln in the autumn of 1862, writing a private line in his own diary just before signing the preliminary proclamation that would begin to end slavery in America. Lincoln wrote, "I promised my God I would do it." And Marden asks us to sit with that for a moment. Here was a man facing the greatest crisis his nation had ever known, And what carried him through wasn't a committee or a poll or a guarantee of success. It was a mighty private resolution, a decision made and kept. Marden then walks us through history's boldest characters: Napoleon, Bismarck, Martin Luther. He points to Joan of Arc, a simple country girl with no army training and no noble blood, who somehow led the king's own soldiers into battle purely because her faith in her mission was so overwhelming that it multiplied her strength 1,000 times over. He tells us about William Pitt, dismissed from office and mocked, who calmly told the Duke, "I am sure I can save this country, and that nobody else can." And within weeks, the king was forced to hand him the reins of England. He tells us about Benjamin Disraeli, jeered and hissed by the entire British Parliament on his first speech, sitting down calmly and saying only, "You will yet hear me," and living to become prime minister. What connects every one of these people, Marden says, is not talent alone. Plenty of talented people fail. What connects them is a colossal, almost stubborn faith in their own capacity. A faith so strong that ridicule cannot shake it, poverty cannot starve it, and failure could not kill it. And then Marden turns a mirror on the reader. He describes a young man who wants to be a lawyer, but surrounds himself with medical books and a medical crowd. Of course he'll never become a great lawyer, Marden says, because he hasn't put himself in the atmosphere of the thing he wants to become. And he asks, how long will it take a person to succeed who surrounds himself instead with an atmosphere of failure, who talks failure, walks like failure, dresses like failure, who is always complaining about the impossible odds stacked against him? Will anyone ever believe in a person like that? Will anyone ever hire him, back him, follow him? Marden had personally interviewed people who let extraordinary opportunities slip past them while less capable people snatched them up. And when he asked them why, the answers were always some version of the same confession. I don't have the courage. I'm afraid of being turned down. It would look too forward of me to push myself. I think I should wait until I'm better prepared. This shrinking, this self-doubt, Marden says, is often a worse enemy to success than actual lack of skill. He tells the story of a modest, retiring man who had a talent so real it was almost being wasted, because his own shrinking manner made him look inferior to everyone he met. That man discovered something surprisingly simple. He began walking to the streets of unfamiliar cities, carrying himself as though he were the mayor, the governor, even the president. Just by carrying that posture, that inner sense of importance, his entire character began to shift. He stopped shrinking from the gaze of strangers and instead began to invite their attention, because now he had the bearing of someone worth knowing. Marden's core claim in this opening chapter is almost mathematical in its simplicity. Your success will never rise higher than your confidence in yourself. You cannot succeed while doubting yourself, while filling your mind with pictures of failure. Every time you confess weakness out loud, you're literally weakening your own foundation. But the reverse is just as true. Self-confidence gathers up every one of your scattered faculties and twists them into one single, powerful cable of achievement. It is, Marden says, the best substitute in the world for a friend's, money, and family pedigree combined. And here's the piece I find most moving. Marden insists that this isn't arrogance he's describing. He calls it a kind of divinity, a proper self-respect that comes from understanding that you are not built to be small, cramped, or apologetic. Every child, he says, should be raised expecting success the way an acorn is destined to become an oak, and it is nothing short of cruel for a parent or teacher to plant seeds of inferiority in a young mind. Without self-faith, he writes, Man is nothing but a plaything of chance, a puppet pulled by circumstance. But with it, he is a king. If Chapter 1 tells us we need to believe in ourselves, Chapter 2 asks an equally important question. What actually wakes that belief up in the first place? Marden opens with a wonderful little scene. A farmer named John Field is told bluntly by the storekeeper where his son Marshall works that the boy will never make a merchant no matter how long he stays, and that the father should just take him home and teach him to milk cows instead. That boy was Marshall Field, who would go on to become one of the greatest merchants in American history, but only after he left that small Massachusetts store and moved to a booming, ambitious young Chicago, a city bursting with energy and possibility. Marden's point is not that Field lacked ability all along. It's that ambition, like a muscle, needs the right environment to be called into action. He compares ambition to a musical talent. If you never practice, it goes dull. If you're constantly surrounded by people who are already reaching and striving, that energy is contagious, and you rise with them. But if you're surrounded by discouragement, indifference, or failure, your own drive slowly falls asleep, no matter how much natural talent you were born with. Marden shares the story of a young girl who, at 15, still had the mental development of a small child, seemingly locked away somewhere deep inside herself, until one day, while listening to music on the street, something in her simply woke up, and within days, she leapt forward years in her development. He tells of a judge who spent much of his life as an illiterate blacksmith, until a single lecture on the value of education stirred something in him that had been sleeping for decades. This is why Marden insists so strongly on choosing your surroundings with real intention. He points to a fascinating real example. A group of Russian shipbuilders sent to America to learn modern methods. Within 6 months, they had transformed, developing initiative, ambition, and excellence that rivaled the best American workers. But within a year of returning home, surrounded again by a slow, unambitious atmosphere, all of that progress had quietly evaporated. The ambition hadn't disappeared because the men had changed. It disappeared because the environment around them had changed. So Marden's advice is direct and practical. Whatever it costs you, stay close to people who believe in you, who understand you, who are themselves striving toward something. Ambition is contagious, he says, and you will absolutely catch the spirit of whatever surrounds you, for better or for worse. Now Marden turns to something that might surprise you coming from a self-help writer of this era, a passionate, almost tender defense of education, but not necessarily the kind you get from a diploma. He opens with John Wanamaker, the great merchant, turning down an invitation to invest in a treasure-hunting expedition to recover sunken doubloons from the ocean floor. Wanamaker's response was that there was a much greater treasure available closer to home, in the mind itself, available to anyone willing to do the work of study. Marden is blunt about the disadvantage of ignorance, no matter how much raw ability a person has. He says, if they are uneducated, they are discounted in the world's eyes. But then he immediately widens what education actually means. He is writing directly to the adult who feels it is too late, who left school young, who is now ashamed of gaps in their knowledge. And his message to that person is simple. It is never too late, and formal schooling was never the only path. He describes people who build a finer education for themselves than many college graduates, simply through the habit of carrying a book in their pocket to read at odd moments, through correspondence courses, through disciplined observation. He tells the story of the great naturalist Agassiz, who would hand a new student a single fish and tell him to observe for an hour, and then, After the student described everything he thought he'd seen, Agassi would simply say, "You haven't really seen the fish yet. Look again." Real seeing, Marden says, real education, comes from training the mind to notice, not merely to glance. He talks about the enormous, often wasted value of spare minutes, the odd ends of time most people throw away without a second thought, and how a habit of using those scraps of time, day after day, can eventually amount to something as valuable as a college degree. He describes a young man who never attended high school at all, but through disciplined use of his spare hours, was eventually offered a college professorship. And he gives a piece of very practical advice that still holds up today. If you're trying to educate yourself, don't wander aimlessly. Find someone, a teacher, a mentor, any competent and educated person willing to help, and let them help you build a real plan, because scattered, directionless reading rarely produces the same discipline as a guided course of study. Here, Marden takes on something a little different. The idea of freedom, not political freedom, but personal freedom from everything that quietly strangles a person's potential. He opens with an image of an athlete preparing for a great contest. No serious competitor would walk into that contest carrying excess weight, wearing clothes that restrict movement, running with sore, cramped feet. And yet, Marden says most of us walk into far greater contests of life carrying exactly that kind of unnecessary baggage, and then wonder why we lose. He tells two quietly devastating stories. First, a young man with real artistic talent who kept drifting from job to job, always intending to break free and study art abroad, always waiting for a more convenient moment, until years slipped by and the ambition simply died inside him, leaving him industrious, honest, but hollowed out. Then a woman with a stunning singing voice and a magnetic personality, discouraged by an unsympathetic family, who gave in a social expectation until her gift withered, leaving her with what Marden describes as a permanent, faraway look of disappointment. What killed these two dreams wasn't a single dramatic failure. It was small, quiet entanglements, timidity, debt, bad partnerships, the fear of being thought too forward. Marden is unflinching about how these things chain even genuinely talented people. He compares it to tying a strong horse with a small cord. The horse never even gets a chance to show its real speed because it's never actually free. He is especially firm about financial entanglement, debt, bad business partners, careless endorsements. These things don't just cost money. They cost freedom of action, freedom of speech, the ability to hold your head up and speak your honest opinion without fear of consequence. He tells the story of a lawyer who made an ironclad rule early in his career to always stay free of debt and entangling alliances, even when it meant losing profitable opportunities. That single rule of independence, more than any brilliant stroke of luck, is what eventually made him both wealthy and deeply trusted. Marden's closing appeal in this chapter is almost fierce. One talent used in freedom, he says, is worth more than genius tied up and entangled, so it can only work at a permanent disadvantage. Guard your independence, he says, as your most sacred possession, because no salary and no promised position is worth trading it away. Now we arrive at one of the most beautiful chapters in the whole book. A defense of dreamers against the practical-minded people who dismiss them. Marden opens with Emerson, sitting among businessmen who have been discussing railroads and stocks, finally saying, "Gentlemen, now let us discuss real things for a while." And by real things, he meant ideas, vision, imagination. Marden calls Emerson the dreamer of dreams, a man who saw the coming civilization long before it arrived. He walks through an incredible parade of so-called impractical dreamers who built the actual physical world we live in. The men who saw teeming cities and what others called nothing but desert and mountain, and built the transcontinental railroads anyway. Columbus, mocked in the streets as a madman, sailing anyway. George Stephenson, a poor miner, laughed for dreaming of a locomotive engine, told by members of parliament that anything faster than a horse was palpably absurd. Robert Fulton jeered at the docks of the Hudson River as a crank before his steamship the Clermont actually sailed. Samuel Morse sneered at by congressmen before his telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore delivered its first message. Charles Goodyear imprisoned for debt, pawning his own wife's jewelry, still dreaming of rubber while his own neighbors called him insane. Every single one of them, Marden says, was dismissed as impractical right up until the moment their dream became so undeniably real that the world had no choice but to build monuments to them instead. And then he makes a claim that I think is the emotional heart of this chapter. He says the divinest heritage of a human being is the capacity to dream, and that even stone walls do not make a prison for someone who can still dream. He talks about the poorest factory girl imagining a beautiful home of her own, the humblest clerk imagining a store of his own, and he insists this dreaming faculty is not foolishness. It is the very thing that keeps courage alive during hardship. But, and this is important, Marden draws a very careful line. Dreaming without effort, he warns, is its own kind of trap. Wishing without working toward the wish undermines character rather than building it. The dreamers who actually change the world were the ones who matched their vision with grit and persistent, practical labor. It is only practical dreaming that counts. He says, dreaming coupled with hard work. Before we continue into the second half of this remarkable book, if you're finding value in these ideas, in the century-old wisdom about self-belief, purpose, and character, take just a second to hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more of Marden's philosophy still ahead, and more classic works like this one coming to this channel. So you won't want to miss what comes next. Marden now turns his attention to something every single one of us does every day, our work, and he asks a piercing question. Is it necessary to ask a man if he likes his work? Shouldn't the answer already be written on his face? He describes two very different kinds of workers. One drags himself to his task like a slave under the lash, feeling every hour of it as drudgery. The other brings his whole soul into the same task. And somehow, even if the work itself is humble, it becomes something close to art. Marden insists that the difference between these two people is not the work itself. It's the spirit they bring to it. He gives us a wonderful gallery of examples. A humble cobbler in a small village who takes more pride in his craft than the local lawyer or clergyman takes in theirs. A farmer who walks his land like a king surveying his kingdom, introducing visitors to his animals as though they were important guests. A poorly paid stenographer who puts more genuine quality into her work than the wealthy owner of the company she works for. A schoolteacher in a remote forest schoolhouse, 25 miles from the nearest railroad, who takes more pride in her students' progress than some college presidents take in theirs. The lesson here is that dignity does not come from the job title. It comes from the standard you personally refuse to fall below. Marden is emphatic that you cannot afford grumbling service or shoddy work in your life's record, because that habit of half-doing things will drag its trail through every part of your future, humiliating you at the most unexpected moments. He makes a claim that reframes the entire purpose of career. Your life's work, he says, is your statue sculpted stroke by every letter you write, every errand you run, every piece of merchandise you sell, every single thought you allow yourself to think. It will be beautiful or hideous, inspiring or debasing, exactly as you make it. And you can no more escape from it than you can rise off the ground by your own will alone. This chapter opens with one of the most vivid images in the entire book. Marden describes a powerful explosive shell, one that could tear a warship apart, but which children could play with, roll around, even shoot to the walls of a building without ever triggering its true power, because it requires a specific, tremendous pressure being fired from a cannon through armor plating before its full force is released. Every person, Marden says, carries something like that same hidden explosive force, and most of us are strangers to our own greatest strength until some enormous responsibility or crisis calls it out. He points to Ulysses Grant and Abraham Lincoln, both of whom lived ordinary, even unremarkable lives for years, farming, storekeeping, practicing modest law, before the crushing responsibility of the Civil War ignited a level of power in them that no ordinary circumstance ever could have. Marden's claim is bold. There is no probability, he says, that Lincoln would be remembered as one of history's greatest men at all, if it were not for that crisis pulling his deepest reserves to the surface. This leads him to a very practical piece of advice for employers and for anyone managing other people. Do not be afraid, he says, to pile responsibility onto the people around you. You will be amazed how quickly they rise to meet it. He tells the story of an elevator boy who never seemed remarkable at all until a fire broke out in the building, and the same overlooked young man ran his elevator through smoke and flame, blistering his hands on a hot cable, saving 100 lives. He tells of a delicate, timid hospital patient who, when fire struck, instantly became a heroine capable of a giant's work. But Marden also has a warning for individuals. He describes men who never really discover their own strength because they consistently shrink from responsibility, always saying, "Oh, someone else can do this better than I can." That habit of shrinking, repeated over years, leaves genuine ability locked away and undeveloped for an entire lifetime. The way to bring out the reserve in yourself, Marden insists, is to deliberately seek out responsibility rather than waiting for it to be forced upon you. Marden begins this chapter with a piece of simple physics. Water has to reach 212 degrees before it generates enough steam to move a locomotive. 200 degrees will not do it. 210 will not do it. Lukewarm water, no matter how close to boiling, will not run anything at all. And that, he says, is exactly the problem with most people's ambitions. They have a general, lukewarm desire to be something, rather than a boiling, overmastering purpose that consumes their whole effort. A mere wish, Marden says, is lukewarm water. It will never actually move your life's train anywhere. He points again to Theodore Roosevelt as an example of someone who never brought a half-hearted effort to anything, who flung his entire life, not merely a portion of it, into every task he undertook. Marden's key claim here is that real resourcefulness and creative power only come from powerful, undivided concentration. And you simply cannot focus your mind on something you are not genuinely enthusiastic about. He gives us a striking metaphor about chemistry, describing how a newly freed atom, called nascent, has its maximum power to bond the very instant it is released, but that power fades the longer it waits idle. Our best ideas and visions work the same way, Marden argues. They arrive full-grown and vivid, ready to be acted on immediately. But if we keep postponing, waiting for a more convenient time, they gradually fade and are lost forever, just like the man in the wilderness that could not be hoarded overnight without spoiling. He describes a man who would feel deeply insulted if you suggested he hadn't worked hard or accomplished much. And yet this same man had spent his entire life jumping enthusiastically from one unfinished venture into another, always dreaming brilliantly, never staying anywhere long enough to actually finish anything. The putting off habit, Marden warns, will kill even the strongest initiative. There's an enormous difference, he says, between the person who merely wishes he could do something and the person who knows with absolute certainty that if he lives, he is going to do the thing he has set his heart on. This chapter opens with a real letter Marden received from a young man earning a very comfortable salary in what he himself called a sham business. A young man who admitted he was expected to trade on the gullibility of poor people who could not afford to be taken advantage of, and who confessed he could not do his best work in a business built on that kind of foundation. Marden's response to this young man, and to everyone in a similar position, is direct and uncompromising. Get out, he says. Do not stay in a questionable occupation, no matter what financial reward it offers, because that false light will eventually land you on the rocks. He describes conscience as a kind of internal compass, one that always points toward what is right the same way a mariner's compass always points north. And he warns that if you tamper with that needle, if you pull around to suit greed or convenience and fasten it there, you are essentially guaranteeing your own eventual shipwreck. He is careful to distinguish between money and success. Making a large salary is not success, he insists, if that money is stained by the sacrifice of other people's rights and comfort, if there's a taint of dishonesty woven through its accumulation. A dirty dollar, he says, is bad business no matter how cleverly you try to gild it. Marden also names a very human trap here, the habit of telling yourself that you'll stay in a compromising job just a little longer, just until you've saved enough to make a change, and how that excuse quietly repeats itself year after year until the habit has become permanent. Every repetition of a wrong act, he warns, makes it more certain to be repeated again, until eventually what you first chose really ends up compelling you completely. His advice to anyone standing at this particular crossroads is almost startling in its intensity. Wear threadbare clothes if you must. Live on one simple meal a day if necessary. But under no circumstance, he says, consent to prostitute your manhood or turn your ability toward doing something unclean, because personal ability, he insists, is greater than any calling and greater than any reward that calling could ever bring you. Here Marden asks what might be the most important question in the entire book. What is the greatest thing that can ever be said about a person, no matter how much they've achieved? And his answer is simple, that they kept their record clean. He uses Abraham Lincoln again as a central example, noting that Lincoln's reputation only grows large with time precisely because he never gambled with his good name. Marden contrasts this with what he calls a terrible spectacle of his own era, senators and congressmen convicted of fraud, financiers exposed for looting the very trust funds of widows and orphans, men who a year earlier had been cheered in public, now afraid to appear before a crowd for fear of being hissed. His argument here is that a person becomes genuinely important the moment the world realizes they stand for something, that they are simply not for sale, that no amount of money or influence can buy their name or their silence. He praises Theodore Roosevelt specifically for refusing every opportunity for political graft that came his way, choosing again and again to lose position rather than accept it dishonestly. Marden brings up Lincoln once more, recalling how, when asked to argue the wrong side of a legal case, Lincoln said he could not do it, because the whole time he stood before the jury he would be thinking, "Lincoln, you're a liar," and he was afraid he would forget himself and say it out loud. That kind of internal honesty, Marden argues, is worth infinitely more than any amount of clever cunning. He closes this chapter with a piece of advice that feels almost like a personal challenge to the listener. Resolve. He says that whatever your career becomes, you're not going to be merely a lawyer, a merchant, a farmer, or a clerk. You're going to be a man or a woman first, last, and always. And everything else you do in life will simply be an expression of that deeper commitment. Marden opens this chapter by pointing directly at the financial panic of his own time, describing wealthy men who had lost everything, some to suicide, some to disgrace. And he uses this as proof of something he wants us to understand clearly, a fortune without genuine character behind it. He says, does not stand for very much at all. His central claim in this chapter is that happiness is not a fluttering, fragile thing that depends on money or circumstance. Real happiness, he insists, inheres in character and personality, and it consists in facing life the right way. No amount of wealth can produce it if a person is facing life the wrong way. He describes an inner monitor that lives inside every one of us, a quiet, honest voice that gives it approval or disapproval to every single thing we do, and which cannot be bribed, silenced, or drowned out, no matter how hard people try with drink, with distraction, or with excitement. True happiness, Marden argues, only comes from harmonizing with the best part of ourselves, and no amount of clever scheming can produce that harmony artificially. He is especially critical of complicated living. He describes dining once at the home of a very wealthy man, where the meal took 2.5 hours to serve across 13 rich courses paired with 7 kinds of wine. And he asks bluntly, how could anyone possibly be healthy or happy on a diet like that? Real happiness, he insists, is actually quite simple, and it usually comes from the quietest, most unpretentious things in life. Small kindnesses, honest work well done, genuine friendship and affection. Marden also draws a firm connection between happiness and usefulness, calling them twins that cannot be separated without disaster. He describes idle young men of wealth who privately admitted to him that they knew it was wrong to refuse the world's work, but that the paralyzing comfort of never having to labor had slowly undermined their own motivation entirely. No one, Marden insists, can truly be happy while living as an idler, because vigorous, purposeful activity is the actual, natural law of human life. This chapter carries a simple, forceful message. No human being, Marden writes, ever made a real success by trying to be somebody else, even if that somebody else was already a success. Success cannot be copied. It is an individual creation, and every person becomes a failure in direct proportion to how far they drift from their own true self in order to imitate someone else. Marden urges a reader to blaze their own path rather than follow old trails. He points out that the world is genuinely hungry for original thinkers, the physician who departs from stale precedent, the lawyer who conducts his case in his own way, the teacher who brings fresh methods into the classroom, the preacher whose sermons come out of real life rather than out of somebody else's book. He shares a fascinating small example. A Boston specialty store whose owners made a habit of doing everything just a little differently, even giving customers their change in brand new, crisp bills straight from the mint rather than old, worn money. It cost almost nothing, but it made the store memorable, and every satisfied customer became a walking advertisement for it. But Marden is careful to clarify something important. Originality for its own sake is not enough. He describes men who chase every new gimmick and device without any judgment about whether it's actually effective, and who waste entire fortunes as a result. It is effective originality, thoughtful, practical, and genuinely useful. That actually counts. He closes with a lovely thought about individuality itself. Nature, he says, never made two things exactly alike, and breaks her mold at every single birth. Try to smooth away your own natural eccentricities in order to fit in is, he argues, as foolish as asking a violet to imitate a rose or a daisy to imitate a sunflower. Real strength, Marden insists, inheres in personality, in simply, fearlessly being yourself. Marden now shifts from character to something surprisingly practical, plain financial competence, and he opens with a striking claim from a prominent New York lawyer that 99 out of every 100 people who make or inherit money eventually lose it. What follows is almost a public service announcement wrapped inside a self-help book. Marden tells story after story of people, often honest, hardworking people, who lost everything because they never learned basic business methods. A widow who signed any document her lawyer put in front of her without reading it and lost her entire property as a result. A woman who didn't realize a check needed to be signed, calling it an awful lot of red tape. Another woman who kept writing checks as long as blank checks remained in her checkbook, genuinely believing that was how bank balances worked. Marden's point is not to mock these people, but to make an urgent argument that no school should ever graduate a young person, however brilliant academically, without a solid grounding in ordinary business principles. He insists that important agreements should always be put in writing, even between trusted friends and family, not because anyone doubts anyone's honesty, but because memories fade and misunderstandings arise, and a little care up front prevents years of heartbreak and lawsuits later. He is especially cautionary about signing over full power of attorney to anyone whose honesty and competence have not been thoroughly proven, describing it as handing someone else the legal power to act as though they were you in every business matter, a tremendous power that should never be given lightly. His closing argument here is refreshingly humble for a book about ambition and self-belief. No matter your vocation, he says, you must be a practical business person first, or you'll always be placed at a serious disadvantage, because it's often far harder to hold on to money wisely than it was to earn it in the first place. Here, Marden explores what he considers one of the rarest and most valuable of all human skills, the ability to accurately read other people. He opens with a wonderful story about Alexander the Great, gravely ill and warned in a letter that his own physician intended to poison him. Alexander read the letter without any visible emotion, hid it under his pillow, and when the physician arrived with prepared medicine, Alexander looked deeply into the man's face, searching for any trace of guilt or fear, found none, and drank the medicine without hesitation. When asked how he could possibly do such a thing after receiving that warning, Alexander simply said, "Because you are an honest man." Marden holds this up as the art of all art for any leader, the ability to size people up, to place them where their strengths will shine and their weaknesses won't matter. He points to Marshall Field, who studied his employees constantly, tracking their progress even when they had no idea he was watching, and who could place the right person in the right position with almost uncanny accuracy, because he looked past what people claimed about themselves and saw the real person underneath. He contrasts this with Ulysses Grant, brilliant as a military general, but who struggled badly as president precisely because he lacked that same skill for reading politicians and placing the right people around him, leaving him too dependent on the advice of friends who did not always deserve his trust. Marden's practical advice here is to actively practice reading people, to watch the involuntary details, the eyes, the manner, the small unconscious gestures, because he says that I simply cannot lie the way words sometimes can. This skill, he argues, protects you from con artists and predatory schemers who specifically target good-hearted, trusting people who have never developed this kind of discernment, and it is just as valuable in business as actual technical knowledge of your trade. Marden opens this chapter with a genuinely striking story. A 15-year-old bellboy arrested for theft, who, when asked why he stole, answered simply, "Because the world owes me a living." This becomes Marden's launching point for one of the most passionate arguments in the entire book. He asks the reader to actually seriously think, about everything the world has already done for them before they were even born. He walks through the true cost behind something as small as a 2-cent orange, the labor of growers, pickers, packers, and shippers across an entire supply chain, just so you can enjoy it for pocket change. He does the same with a simple yard of cotton cloth, tracing it back through cotton fields, mill workers, packers, and railroad men. His argument is that every single comfort we enjoy carries centuries of accumulated sacrifice behind it. The blood spilled to purchase our freedoms of speech, the lonely lives spent developing the sciences we take for granted, the labor of untold thousands who built the roads and railways and safety systems we use without a second thought. Given all of that, Marden asks, how can anyone possibly claim the world owes them anything more when they haven't yet given anything back in return? He is unusually harsh here toward inherited wealth given without corresponding character or effort. He points to wealthy young men raised in idleness and argues that these young men are actually cheated, not blessed, because no fortune can transfer the actual stamina, creativity, and self-reliance that only comes from a person's own struggle. He describes idleness itself as carrying a built-in penalty, a kind of rust and decay that begins the moment a mind stops actively working. Marden's conclusion here is almost a moral law. You are, he says, a personal debtor to the world, and the only currency the universe actually accepts as payment is personal service. Nobody, no matter how rich their father was, can pay that debt for you by proxy. Marden takes on a very specific myth in this chapter, the idea of luck, and he handles it with real nuance. He does not pretend luck doesn't exist at all. He openly admits that chance events, an inheritance, a fortunate marriage, being in the right place at the right moment, genuinely do reshape people's lives sometimes. But then he asks a pointed question. What has luck actually ever built? Did chance invent the telegraph? Did it lay the ocean cable, build the great steamships, or tunnel through mountains? He runs through a list of towering historical figures, Washington, Lincoln, Webster, Grant, Edison, and asks what luck had to do with any of their actual achievements. His sharpest observation is about the excuse itself. He says he has never known a man to amount to much until he cut the words good luck and bad luck completely out of his vocabulary, along with all the accompanying I can't philosophy. He offers a wonderful metaphor here. That luck is simply the tide, nothing more. And the strong man rows with it when it favors his direction and rows against it when it doesn't, rather than sitting still and blaming the current. He tells the story of a Minnesota governor asked how he accounted for his own success, who answered simply, I just try to make good. Despite having fought poverty and difficult circumstances his entire life, without ever once complaining that luck was against him. Marden's closing thought here is that good luck, so-called, actually follows good sense, good judgment, careful preparation, and downright hard work, and that the truly lucky man is usually just a person who is already prepared the moment opportunity happened to walk by. This chapter reads almost like an investigative expose, and it may be Marden's most emotionally charged writing in the entire book. He describes a wave of financial scandals sweeping through America at the time. Senators sentenced to prison, congressmen indicted for fraud, men who had been publicly cheered and admired only months earlier, now unable to appear in public without being hissed. He uses a beautiful, precise metaphor to frame the whole chapter. A tiny flaw that can cut the value of an otherwise flawless $1,000 diamond down to almost nothing, invisible to the casual eye, but devastating once discovered under close examination. That flaw, Marden argues, is exactly what dishonesty does to an otherwise brilliant reputation. His argument here is uncompromising. What the world actually demands of you, whatever your career, whatever your financial outcome, is simply that you be a genuine person of character. You cannot afford success with a flaw baked into it, he says, because eventually, almost always, that flaw gets discovered and no accumulated wealth can buy back a good name once it's gone. He describes a strange, haunted existence of dishonest men in high positions, living in what he calls perpetual terror that some hidden fact might surface and expose them, and he compares this to Banquo's ghost, appearing uninvited at every single feast they try to enjoy. There is, he insists, no bribing your own conscience, no matter how much money or clever mystification you throw at the problem. But Marden ends this particular chapter on a note of real encouragement rather than despair. He specifically tells his younger readers, don't lose your faith in humanity just because some of your idols have fallen, because the overwhelming majority of people really are honest, and he urges them to let these public failures make them even more determined to build their own lives on the unshakable rock of right and justice instead. And now we arrive at the final chapter, the one I promised would change how you see your own beginnings, whatever they were. Marden opens by quoting Andrew Carnegie directly, who said that the misfortune of being a rich man's son is actually a heavy weight in life's race, because most wealthy sons cannot resist the temptations that come with easy money, while the poor boy sweeping out the office floor is often the dark horse who ends up taking every prize. Marden's entire argument in this final chapter is a defense of poverty, not as something to romanticize or wish upon anyone, but as an enormously effective, if brutal, teacher. He runs through an astonishing list of self-made men who rose from real poverty: Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, and points out that our greatest merchants, inventors, and statesmen were overwhelmingly pushed forward by the very goal to necessity they might otherwise have resented. He offers a memorable image here, comparing a young man raised entirely in comfort and always lean on others to a weak sapling in a forest, compared with a giant oak that fought every single inch of its growth against real wind and real storms. Strength of character, Marden insists, must genuinely be run out of obstacles actually overcome. It simply cannot be manufactured any other way, and no father can do his son's push-up for him at the gymnasium of life while the son sits comfortably on the bench watching. He quotes a senator who once said he saves his sympathy not for poor children, but for rich ones, because handing a young man a fortune before he's built any character to match it doesn't actually give him a head start. It takes away the very obstacle that would have made him strong in the first place. Marden's very last point, the one I want to leave you with, is this: poverty by itself has no value as a permanent condition. It's a curse, a kind of slavery, and nobody should romanticize it. Its only real value is as a starting point, as the raw material a person struggles honestly against on the way up. It is that struggle itself, that persistent, unglamorous climb towards something better, that quietly builds the actual human being underneath. And nature, Marden writes in his final lines, cares far less about the money or the property a person gains along that climb than she does about the person she is patiently, relentlessly shaping in the process. So here we are at the end of a book written more than a century ago by a man who started life with nothing at all and who spent the rest of his years convincing others that where you start is never the same thing as where you have to end up. If there is one thread running through every single chapter we've covered today, it's this. The mind you bring to your circumstances matters more than the circumstances themselves. Self-belief without effort is just wishful thinking. But effort without self-belief rarely gets off the ground in the first place. Character, honestly built and carefully guarded, will outlast any fortune. Ambition needs the right company to stay alive. Education can be built one spare minute at a time. Freedom from debt and entanglement is worth more than almost any salary. Dreams matter, but only the ones you're willing to actually work for. And whatever hardship shaped you, whatever poverty or struggle you came from, it was never a curse to be pitted. It was raw material, waiting for you to prove what could be built from it. Marden believed, all the way down to his bones, that the person reading his words was capable of far more than they currently believed about themselves. 100 years later, sitting wherever you're sitting right now, listening to this, I think that message still lands exactly the same way it always did. If this book gave you something to think about today, do one small thing before you go. Hit that subscribe button so the next one finds you. There are more stories like this one waiting. More voices from across the last few centuries who figured something out worth passing along. And I would genuinely love for you to be here when the next one arrives. Until then, remember Marden's whole argument, boiled down to the 6 words that gave this book its name. He can who thinks he can. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.